Today we're going to do a deep dive into squatting leverages. I've done this for deadlifts in the past, but since then I've gotten a ton of requests to do it for squatting. I know a lot of you have trouble with your squats. Either you can't find a comfortable and confident position, or you feel like there's some technical component that you're missing. So we're going to get into that. We're going to break down exactly how leverages work, how to evaluate your squatting mechanics using these principles, and we're going to give some examples of the best squatters in the world, and we're going to try to pick apart and understand why their approach might work for them. So let's get into that right now. The basics of leverages, we're talking about the relationship between some external load and a pivot point around which it moves. So I want you to conceptualize this implement right here. This actually looks like a strongman event. They used to have the fishing pole lift where you'd have a guy try to grab this giant pole and pull it back. They also had Thor's hammer at one of the Rogue Arnold meets that was a really cool implement. But basically you have this pivot point that it moves around, this long arm, and some weight at the end. Now, the thing is, we determine how much work is going to be required to move that weight based on how long the moment arm is. Now, it's not just the length of the actual implement, it's the horizontal distance between the pivot point and the center of mass. We always measure horizontally when dealing with free weights because the principle is you measure perpendicular to the line of force. Well, the line of force is always gravity, which is vertical, so we always measure horizontally. That changes if you're dealing with cables or machines. If you're doing a free weight curl, then the moment arm is the absolute longest when the length of your forearm is horizontal, when it's perpendicular to the line of force of gravity. But if all of a sudden you're attached to a cable setup where the pulley is directly in front of you, that changes. This is actually at rest, and the moment arm is the longest when you're perpendicular to that horizontal line of force, which is now vertical. So that's why it always changes with machines and different implements like that. You always have to be aware of that. For free weights, it's a bit simple. So notice that as this thing levers up, that moment arm shrinks. The center of mass is now horizontally closer to the pivot point. That represents a leverage advantage, a mechanical advantage. So if you consider our squatter right here, we have our pivot points, the hip and the knee. Those are the big ones that we're worried about. And at the bottom of a squat, we can see where the moment arm is. It's relative to that center of mass. That's where the bar sits. That's where you're nice and balanced. So the pivot point horizontally from that center of mass, we can see it's here, it's a little bit longer in the hip than the knee. So that means the hip is doing a bit more work, which is appropriate, much bigger joint. Now, as you begin to stand up, remember, still measuring horizontally, we can see those joints get closer to the center of mass, so that moment arm shrinks. This is why you are in a mechanically advantaged position closer to lockout. This is why, half reps don't count, right? Because you can move so much more weight in that position. It's why a 500-pound squatter can do a partial yoke pick with 1,000 pounds. You get so much more weight moved per unit of effort. So that's really important to keep in mind. Now, the earliest application of leverage is, let's say you have a big rock. This rock weighs a ton. Well, how do you move the rock? Well, if you have a stick that's sufficiently strong enough and a pebble, you can wedge the stick underneath the rock and use the pebble as a pivot point, and you can actually move that rock. Now, if everything's balanced, let's say that pivot point is in the center of that stick, well, now it's like a seesaw. You need equal and opposite load to move that rock. So if it's a 1-ton rock, you would need a ton on the other end. However, if you take that moment arm out, if you use a much longer stick, if that fulcrum gets closer and closer to the rock over here, all of a sudden, the same amount of weight has a much bigger effect. So instead of 1 ton right here, you might need a fraction of that at the very end. This is why Archimedes said, give me a long enough lever and I can move the world. Real quick, guys, if you haven't hit that subscribe button, please do me a big favor. If you found any of this information helpful, go ahead and hit the subscribe and the notification buttons, because I am making the hard trek to 100,000 and I can't do it without your support. This channel has already done so much more than I thought it could do, but your guys' support has shown me that we still have miles to go. I appreciate everybody's help. It is the only reason that I can do this full time, so thank you for that. Well, this also works in reverse, and this is how we conceptualize lifting. If we have to work from that pivot point to move something up, it's not gonna take very much weight if we have a really long lever to absolutely staple us. It's always in our best effort to have a shorter lever. We'll always be able to move more weight. So that's a lot of what goes into finding an optimal setup in powerlifting. You're finding where your leverages are the best. You're finding where you get the most bang for your buck. Now, I've also talked about this in the past. That's great for performance, but remember, the way we practice, it's also our main developmental movement. So there's a trade-off there, because if we only lift in the most advantaged position, we can potentially limit our ability to develop ourselves more thoroughly. This is something I experienced with bench pressing. Very limited range of motion, high arch bench pressing for a long time. Didn't do my upper body any justice, even though I got to the point where I could move quite a bit of weight in that setup. So that's something to consider. There is definitely a trade-off here. Now, what we're gonna talk about first is how individual limb differences might impact your setup, how it might make squatting seem very awkward, very uncomfortable, or how it might be a breeze. So this is our, let's call it our neutral lifter. This is a guy who doesn't really have excessively long legs, excessively long back. This is how most of you are actually gonna be. Most of you are gonna have relatively even proportions. So starting with our neutral squatter, all we did over here is we lengthened the femur. So now as the femur comes out, the hips have to come back, which results in a more pitch forward position. Now you see, if you have a neutral cervical spine, if your neck isn't like extending back, looking up to the sky, you can see how the gaze changes, looking at down at a slight angle to looking down to a point in the floor that's closer to you. And that gives you a sense of how much more that upper body is dumping forward. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this. This just is going to give you some insight. If you have a hard time squatting, let's say you're going for a very upright position and you have a hard time, your hips feel like they automatically go back, that's a sign that your femurs might be long relative to your torso. Now, let's say you do have a really long femur and it forces your hips back, but let's say you want to do Olympic lifting where you don't have a choice. You have to stay high bar. You have to figure out a way to get that upright position so you can receive a clean or a snatch in the bottom position. Well, that's going to require a lot more dorsiflexion. You can get in that position. Your hips have to be mobile, your ankles have to be mobile. You have to shove your knees forward much farther. You might have to push your knees out to the side to shorten that front to back distance. There's a way to do it, but it probably requires a lot more work, a lot more mobility. Something else has to give. Now, on the other hand, if we go from our neutral lifter into somebody with a very, very short femur, the best examples of this are going to be those with dwarfism. There's a couple powerlifters that are very short and they have proportions like this, and they typically bench and squat a ton and have a lot of trouble deadlifting. But you notice that with the very, very short femur, you get ass to grass very, very easily. The upper body doesn't really have to dump forward at all. It doesn't have to pitch forward. It's all in the knee. You see very short moment arm in the hip, very big moment arm as far as the knee is concerned. And it basically turns into a standing leg press. Now, this certainly isn't set in stone. This is really just to help you evaluate if you have an extreme build. This is how you're going to bias one way or another in your squatting. But there are multiple reasons why people of any type of build might try to squat one way or another. Olympic lifting, again, is a perfect example. You need to squat very upright in that position because that's how you practice and play in your sport. Whereas somebody might have a separate reason for wanting to do a more hip dominant squat, even if they're built with very short femurs. I know I've gone back and forth. I've used this setup getting ready for powerlifting meets. I've used it to work around knee tendonitis. I've used it when I was specifically trying to focus on my deadlift and where squatting was just an accessory to get my posterior chain stronger. But whether you're a bodybuilder who's trying to focus on one muscle group or another, or whether you're a powerlifter who's trying to carefully choose accessory movements, these types of changes are going to have a big impact on which joints and therefore which muscles are getting the lion's share of the work. Now, to connect some dots here, this is also why when you see somebody doing a squat morning, when they have a really hard time coming up evenly out of the hole, when they tend to do the stripper thing where their knees straighten out, their hips go back, and then they come up, we generally attribute that to weak quads, because when your hips are that far back, the only way you can stand up is if you have a very, very strong posterior. You're moving into a position where literally all of the work is being done in the hip. You have the longest moment arm there, where when the knees come back, the moment arm is very, very small with the knee, and that's the only way the knee can extend. Whereas if those quads were stronger, the knee would be able to extend from that longer moment arm position. So that's a little bit of insight if you have trouble with that particular movement. It's also a reason why a lot of exclusive high bar squatters, CrossFitters and Olympic lifters have this trouble, where they will become very, very good high bar squatters. They'll have like a front squat that's like 90% of their back squat max, but they'll have very underdeveloped hamstrings, and that will affect them on certain events, specifically with deadlifting. It's possible to get a very, very good high bar squat, to have really strong glutes and quads, but to have a deadlift that lags behind because the hamstrings aren't used nearly as much. What do the hamstrings do? They extend the hip. But if your moment arm and the hamstrings is always very, very small, they don't get stressed enough to grow. And this goes back to what I was saying about the developmental movement and your competitive movement being the same thing. So when you're evaluating somebody else's squat technique, or when you're trying to modify your own, you have to keep in mind the way the individual is built that might predispose them towards one setup or another, but also you have to keep in mind what the actual goal of the squat variation is, because you can modify it to be more comfortable, to be more mechanically advantaged so you can lift more weight on the platform, or you can modify it to get some developmental effect that you're looking for. And that's ultimately going to dictate where your best position is. The bottom line is that you get good at how you train. So if you commit yourself to a method that you feel comfortable with, that is going to likely provide the best result after so many years than if you force yourself into a position that looks advantaged but may not be intuitive or may not be comfortable for you. Now, this is how my squatting has evolved over the years. I have very short femurs relative to my torso, so I am in that camp of I never understood why people had a hard time squatting, because for me it was like just sitting straight down in the pocket and standing back up. And you're going to see that as I change my squat setup, it's not obvious that it looks that different because I have a lot of play in the joints. I can move my feet a lot. I can do different things with my hips. The moment arms don't really change that much. I feel the difference, but you may not see the difference. So starting out, I was historically always a very narrow squatter. So you can see that I'm pushing my knees forward quite a bit. I'm staying very upright. My back angle doesn't change a lot. And I built a lot of compression here. I would feel a lot of compression through my hips and my knees. I would compress down. It was very easy to change direction. I'd utilize stretch reflex pretty aggressively. I could rebound pretty hard out of the bottom. And this is always where I felt the strongest. And because I was so good here, I was also really good with front squats. And that was a staple movement in strongman, having the weight in front of you. If any of you feel like front squats are horrible, it's because likely you can't stay as upright as you need to. That your leverages or how tight your knees, ankles, hips are is pushing your hips back, causing you to lean forward, and that's what makes it horrible. Aside from the weight being on your collarbone, just feeling awful to begin with. But because I could stay so completely vertical, I had a very easy time with front squats, so I always excelled at movements that benefited from front squatting. Now, this is a good example of where my stance is at any given time. It's hard to tell. Look at how close my heels are together. My heels stay pretty close, my toes out a little bit, and this allowed me to stay pretty upright. Now, I deliberately ended up changing my stance for two reasons. One, I was trying to overhaul my deadlift, so I shifted my squat to a more accessory movement to put more of the work into my posterior chain, into my hips. And also I was working around some knee tendonitis. Well, it stands to reason if you want the knee tendon to deal with less force, then you shorten the moment arm. That means you keep the knees back, you put more of the work into your hips. And this actually did wonders for my deadlift for the years that I trained like this. Now, it's not quite as obvious at first glance, but again, look at my heels. My heels are a bit wider. I'm focusing on pushing my knees back a bit more, and I have the bar a bit lower down my shoulders. So I'm consciously focused on sitting back into my hips. And the sensation, it's like when you do a leg press, you have your feet high and wide, you'll feel more of a stretch through your hamstrings, your adductors, and through your glutes. And that's where a lot of the power comes from. It also helped out quite a bit when I was preparing for Clash on the Coast. There was a squat like they have in World's Strongest Man where the barrels have to touch the box at the bottom. This allowed for a much more controlled descent and change of direction, which was very, very important. A lot of guys zeroed this event. If you have a very reactive squat style where you bounce aggressively at the bottom, it's very hard to control the weight. So I had to practice having the stopping power through my hips in order to handle the weight. And I ended up doing okay in that event. So now that we've covered leverages and how that might influence your setup, I want you to look at this video because this gives a much better visual representation of exactly how things move once you change one variable.
Second thing that affects how far forward your knee goes is this length that we could call tibia, but it would be more accurate to call it floor to knee, because anything under your heel affects that height or the length of this segment, And as you notice, if I lift the heel, it travels forward. As it travels forward, the butt comes forward.
So this is a great example of how Olympic lifting shoes work. Anything that lifts your heel up forces your knees forward. So it allows you to have that knee forward position, it pulls your butt forward, and it allows a lot of people to have a more upright position. It's exactly why it's used in Olympic lifting, but it also helps other people with their squatting ability.
So right now, let's take a look. If I put a very short tibia on this person, you're going to notice that their ability to squat down starts to look like he's leaning really far forward. If this person's tibia was longer, they're just collapsing more. They're not necessarily leaning forward more, and that's going to totally change how it feels on their low back.
So if you have limited dorsiflexion, limited ankle mobility, that could be keeping your knees back, so elevating your heel by wearing shoes or putting your heels on plates or a board or a mat might be able to help you get a little lower and stay a little more upright. I always recommend people try that out before they commit to buying shoes. A lot of people notice immediately that their squat is better once they do that. This also shows the tibia relationship, which we really didn't get into. The longer your tibia is, the easier a time you're going to have accommodating that lower position.
But what if your femur was ridiculously long compared to this segment right here? You are never going to be able to squat all the way down. You're never going to be able to fold all the way up, ever. In order to get any lower than this, you're probably going to feel like you're falling. If, by contrast, you had someone with proportionally shorter femur, proportionally longer floor to knee, and proportionally longer torso in terms of where they can put the weight, this person can fold up, sit all the way down, and they have no idea why anybody thinks squatting is difficult.
So let's look at this in practice. Let's look at some of the most famous squatters of all time and see if we can draw some conclusions as to why they squat the way they do. This is Idalberto Aranda, who is a Cuban weightlifter. And this is kind of famous in weightlifting circles because he had such a unique build where his squats, they almost looked like smoke and mirrors. It's like, don't blink or you'll miss the squat. This guy has very short femurs, and I would actually say a longer tibia. So he's an example of this prototypical squatter, where as he comes down and bounces up, the front to back action of where the hips have to go is so stunted, it's so short that the squatting goes off in a very quick, very efficient manner. And this is, of course, an extreme build. Very few people are built this way. But just look how compact and efficient that movement is. Now we move forward to Andrey Malanichev, who is one of the best squatters in history. He had the squat world record for a long time. I want you to look at how massive his upper body is relative to his legs. His legs almost look undersized relative to his huge upper body. One of the things I look at when I'm trying to determine if an individual has a long torso or not is the distance between their belt and the bottom of their chest. If you got a lot of real estate around your abdomen area when your belt's on, that means you got a pretty decently lengthened torso. But I also look at how far the shoulders are from the knees at the very bottom of the squat. So you see when Malanichev squats down, you see that the shoulders are quite a bit away from his knees. Now this is an example of somebody where it's reasonable to think that the reason they become one of the best squatters in the world is because they were predisposed to this movement. They have leverages that were conducive to very, very efficient squatting patterns. If he had a much longer femur or a shorter torso, if you had to pitch forward more, if finding depth was a little bit more cumbersome, you have to ask, would he still have been able to climb that mountain? And it's a hard question to answer because there are plenty of good squatters who have worked around different mechanics, but we tend to see this build represented more thoroughly amongst the best squatters in the world. Now we have Ray Williams, who's another giant of a man, one of the best squatters ever, got close to an 1,100 pound squat in sleeves, which is just absolutely absurd. Now because Ray is so big, it might be hard to pin at first, but Ray is actually built similarly to Malanichev. His squatting style is subtly different, feet a little bit wider, knees out a little bit more. But again, look at that real estate between his belt and his chest. He has a pretty long torso. As he hits the bottom, he's very upright, knees very far away from the shoulders, and he just has a ton of hip and thigh power along with a reduced moment arm, again, that lends itself to the best possible squatting mechanics. Then we got Dan Bell, more of the same. Again, longer torso, shorter legs. Squatting is very, very easy for this individual. You see how compact he is. You see how much compression he can get at the bottom. I mean, here he is squatting in equipment. He goes back and forth very easily. Both of his styles involve him being very upright. The only difference is in equipment, his feet have to come out a bit wider. Dan almost does like a plie when he squats. So even though he has a relatively narrow stance, by pushing the knees out, that front to back distance in his already short femurs gets very, very, very shortened, and he cuts just right to parallel. And because he's already mechanically advantaged, and because he's optimized his leverages even further, he is able to move just insane amounts of weight. Then you pair that with him being like 400 pounds and a genetic specimen, and that's a recipe for having the best squat in history. So now we're gonna get into some lifters who have a little bit longer leg proportions relative to their height. Dan Green has a very distinct squatting style, wider stance, knees way out. You can see his femurs are a bit long relative to his torso. It's not hugely obvious, but at the bottom of the squat, you can see how close his shoulders get to his knees. You can see how bent forward he is. Dan also must have hips that point out a little bit. This is another factor that is going to help determine squatting style. You can't accommodate this very wide setup unless you have hip sockets that point out. If they point out forward, you'll just run into bone when you try to do that, and it'll be uncomfortable, even painful at the bottom. Here, that outward hip socket, it allows him to shove his knees out to the side, and all of that tissue in the hamstrings and the groin pulls very, very tight. We see David Douglas built very much the same with a wide stance. Being able to get depth with this wide stance that very, very few people can accommodate. Most people, if they try to get their feet that far outside of their hips and their shoulders, they're gonna have a real hard time getting depth. They're gonna feel super tight. They're not going to feel strong, and they're going to feel exposed. As you get stronger, the groin and the hamstring get so strong that it can stop all that weight. And if you have the hip shape and the mobility, you can actually get a little bit of rebound. But that is a very, very particular build that can accommodate that. It is not that common, with the exception of equipped squatting, where you have all of that material taking out the tension and supporting you at the bottom where you're that vulnerable. But that's just a testament to these two lifters and how strong their hips are to be able to stop and support the weight in that position. It's also one of the reasons why Dan Green was such a good sumo puller, because he has that insane hip strength in that very wide kind of disadvantaged position. Then we go into John Haack, and I like reviewing John's lifts because it flies in the face of so much common training wisdom. John, if anything, his legs are maybe a bit long, but it's not that obvious, but he squats high bar, shoving his knees forward a ton, very compressed, very explosive, very reactive squatter. And John looks just super comfortable. And he always says that he squats, he lifts the way he does because it was the most comfortable when he started out. He didn't think, hey, is this the most mechanically advantaged? Am I going to be able to game the system here? He just lifted how he was comfortable, and that reinforced his success. So that just goes to show you get strong at the way you train. John does not appear to have an advantage setup, yet he is going to go down in history as the GOAT. And the last one here is Lasha, and I like looking at Lasha because he's so tall and leggy. He looks like a guy that should really have a hard time, but he doesn't. He sits right in the pocket. Now, a lot of this is mobility. You have to be excessively mobile to be an Olympic lifter, more so than powerlifters or bodybuilders or anybody else. So getting that ankle, that hip, that knee mobility is going to help even taller, leggy guys accommodate these positions. But Lasha is also a good example of a tall tibia. Notice as he squats down, his femurs don't look excessively long. His hips aren't being shoved back. He doesn't have to really over-rotate his knees out to the side. Lasha is an example of what having a really long tibia can do for you, because even as a guy who's very tall, where most of his height looks to be made up in his legs, the fact that his tibias are tall make it easier for him to sit into this bottom position, and that is how he receives 600-pound cleans and 500-pound snatches. And it's no doubt an important component as to why he is such an effective lifter. So hopefully this gave you some valuable insight into squatting mechanics. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you have questions or if there's things I didn't touch on, go ahead and leave it in the comments, or better yet, take it to Patreon. That's the easiest way to get in touch with me to get your questions answered. It's also where I upload videos daily about my own training, so you get to see exactly how I put these principles into practice in real time. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.